Thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us at QualLab's first lunch talk this semester. My name is Mian Fei, and I am a graduate research associate at the QualLab, which is a research center focusing on advising qualitative inquiry towards innovation, equity, diversity, and justice at the Ohio State University's College of Education and Human Ecology. So joining us today is Dr. Claudio García-Louis from the University of Texas at San Antonio. And she will soon give us a presentation on accounting for a colonial past that racializes LatinX as MestizXs in education research. So before we start, we wish to acknowledge that the land of the Ohio State University is located on the traditional homeland of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, Wyandot nations and other indigenous nations who have strong ties to this land. So today's agenda is very straightforward. So we will first have some words of welcome and an introduction to the QualLab from our director, Dr. Penny A. Pasque. I will then say a few housekeeping rules of the lunch talk before Dr. García-Louis gives her presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so you will have the opportunity to ask questions. And I will close today's lunch talk by telling you how you can get involved in the QualLab. So Dr. Pasque, please take it away by welcoming all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Yun Yun. It is so great to have you and this team here. I think this is just such a fabulous team at the QualLab. And so thank you for coming and joining us and being in community with us. As Mian mentioned, we are a research center that really focuses on qualitative research, and we are a part of really elevating qualitative for the community in the college as well as across the country and globe. So we welcome you to events like this, and on our website you can find the future QualLab lunches for the semester, which we'll talk about at the end. You can see our fabulous team. We have resources up on the website. We are planning our Advanced Methods Institute and have secured for our award-winning Rory Latson-Billings as our award winner this year, and we look forward to making more announcements around the QualLab Advanced Methods Institute coming up in June really soon. So we hope you join us at some of these events and check out our website. And I'm going to pass it over to this fabulous team in back to everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasque. So just a few housekeeping items. So please turn off your microphone during the presentation, but please feel free to share any questions or comments using the chat space. And Dr. García-Louis will address your question during the Q&A session in the end, or you can just turn on your microphone and raise a question directly towards her. I want to draw your attention that the session is being recorded, and you will be able to access the recording on our YouTube channel after the session. Closed captioning is provided during the session, and you can enable the function at the bottom right corner of your video box. So now let's welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Claudio García-Louis. And before she starts, I will have the honor and pleasure to introduce her. So Dr. Claudio García-Louis is an associate professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. She is a Mexican immigrant, Latina mommy scholar, and former first in the family and first generation college student. Her scholarship is interdisciplinary in nature, and she engages in topics of Latinidad, LatinX identity development, education equity, culture, race, and ethnicity. She seeks to disrupt negative stereotypes about LatinX, minoritized populations, and underrepresented college students through the critical incorporation of culturally appropriate asset-based methodological approaches. Her research centers on disrupting the racialization and homogenization of the US LatinX population by underscoring intragroup racial, culture, and linguistic diversity. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Garcia-Louis. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation and for allowing me to be here today. I come to you from Yanaguana. Excuse me. Sorry, I got a prompt. I come to you from Yanaguana, which is currently known as San Antonio, the ancestral lands of the Comecrudo and Carrizo Nation. It is a privilege for me to be here. I absolutely love and admire Dr. Penny Pasque. Very exciting to be here today. So can I share my screen? It looks like, there we go. Okay. And I have a brief PowerPoint. I know I have 25 minutes. I'm a talker, so I actually have printed slides so that I stick to my points. But I also, a lot of the presentation is inspired by it's largely inspired by a manuscript that is available for you all to also access and dive deeper into this information. But feel free to, write questions, post questions as I am presenting. So let me share my screen. So I want to start with my positionality and who I am. This is my familia. Those of you who know me or are on my social media, I make it very evident that my family is my inspiration. They're my past, my future, and my present and my future. My daughter, the little one right there, it's her birthday today. She's 9. And so it's very important for me to be here today for many reasons. She is the reason why I engaged and embarked on this journey of really looking at Latinx heterogeneity because of her, because I wanted her, when she was older, for her to read scholarship that centered her identities, that talked about who she was, that adequately represented her, and that did not bisect her as being Black and Latina, but rather an Afro-Latina. So I've written about my children being Haitian, and that's something that I continue to utilize as, a source of motivation and inspiration. As an individual, I'm a Mexican immigrant. I immigrated from Mexico when I was 4 years old to the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Oregon. I was a farm worker, so I worked in the fields, and that's where I got to see a lot of social inequities that took place. We lived in a tiny cabin with an outhouse and no kitchen. So those experiences were foundational to the type of scholarship that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm the 5th oldest. My parents had 5 children. I'm the 3rd oldest, but the first in my family to graduate from high school and the first to go to college. And I talk a lot about how there's a difference between being first gen and being first in family. If you're first gen, you got older siblings helping you out. But if you're first in family, everything is new. So a lot of that is also foundational in my scholarship. I'm a daughter, a wife, a mother, an educator, and I put scholar for the first time because I just earned tenure, and I'm starting to get to the point where I'm like, maybe there is something that I'm adding and contributing that is unique. So that scholar identity is still one that I'm becoming very that's starting to become a little bit more comfortable with me saying. So yes, I included that for the first time here today, but it also ties in with a lot of the scholarship and stuff that I will be talking about today. I want to begin with some of you may have already, explored scholarship on Latinidades and Latinx individuals. Some of you may not have, but you may have ran into all of these different idioms utilized to describe Latinx folks in the United States. So terminology and signifiers are really important to recognize. I want to identify that these are just a few of the many that have been utilized in scholarship to talk about the Latinx diaspora as a whole. So there's Latinx, there's Latinx with a capital X, which is what I have been utilizing, and I'll explain a little bit about why I have selected that. There's Hispanic, Latinx, Latina OX, Latin asterisk, and Hispanic amongst all the, Hispanic twice, right? I guess because it's just so pushed on us. That was a typo. But I utilize the signifier Latinx with a capital X because And because Milan 2019, she talked about the X complicates the identity of Latinos. X, which complicates and makes space for discussions that do not solely rely on binary configurations. It accounts for the experiences in the labor force, geographic crossings, placing emphasis on a capital X represents the liminality of LatinXs in the US, who move underground in spaces of unknowability, of transition, of crossings. The ultimate X, which includes political, geographic, and hemispheric realities of the colonized peoples. And so that's why I have adopted Latinx. In the past, I have used a variety of all of these except Hispanic. And so for now on, I wanted to make sure that I talked a little bit about that. Also, I love this figure right here because Latinos have been racialized, but we're not a race. And I wanted to make sure that it was understood that Latinos as a whole, we are racially diverse, culturally diverse, geographically diverse, and Latinx folks in the US are not MestizXs, which is what we have, which is in the title. MestizXs folks, as proposed by Jose Vasconcelos, is a mixture of European indigenous blood, but it leaves out our Afro-Latinx identity. It leaves out a lot of the history that is native to our nation. So I wanted to present this as a reminder of that. So history matters, and I learned that history matters after I kept reading and questioning a lot about myself. I kept reading and then questioning about myself. Why do I feel shy about requiring people to say Claudia instead of Claudia? Why do I feel apologetic when I require people to put an accent on my last name when they leave it out? And so there was a lot of these whys. Why do I feel out of place when I'm in a majority white space? Why do I not feel intelligent enough? And oftentimes those questions have come in the form of, well, that's called imposter syndrome, or that's called this, or that's called that. But having a justification wasn't enough for me. Having a name to put to having a word to put to an experience wasn't enough for me. And so I began reading a little bit more about history. And when I was in high school, I hated history. History was boring to me. History was it wasn't my favorite topic. But it wasn't until I started learning about myself that I began to really like history and dive deeper into history. And so I firmly believe that understanding history is to understand the contemporary manifestations of isms for Latinx folks in particular here in the US. Latinx and Hispanic ethnicity has been grouped into a singular identity. And as we think about who are Latinx folks and what are their experiences, it's really important that we understand that Hispanic, for example, does not exist outside of the United States. And so does that mean that Hispanic people don't exist, period? Is something that I always tell people when they're like, well, you're Hispanic. Well, it's only in the US. But also how geography and the social construction of race and ethnicity is contingent upon certain spaces, and the spaces have history, have a history with the local people, have a history with colonization as a whole. So reminding ourselves of that. Also, heterogeneity of race, culture, religion, language, and other systems run through and between the Latinx diaspora. What that means is that we have multiple languages that we speak. Our cultures are different. Even though we speak Spanish, we have multiple words for one thing, and it's not just by country of origin, it's also by region. We have Spanglish that we have centered in the United States as our primary form of communication, and how what language is able to communicate experiences that may not exist in Latin American countries. But today, what I want to focus on is on how colonial Latin American past has influenced Latinx identities in the United States. So how did we get here? Well, the real, the quick and simple response is it's super complicated, right? It's tied to land. Identity is tied to land and the history that took place on that land. When I was growing up, one of the things that I felt was I felt foreign. I felt like I was out of place. I would go to Mexico and they would say, "Tú eres gringa, you know, you're gringa." And my notion of gringa was not me, or you're pocha. But then I was in the US and I was never from the US. I was never welcomed at being from the US. So this notion of not having land was something that was very difficult to me until I learned that there was a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There was all of these different things. I learned that that the border, I didn't cross the border crossed us, right? And I began diving deeper into history. What does that look like? And what are the material consequences for people like myself? So that's where the notion of land has history, and social political events within that land also have continuous impact on people's simple things. Like in Texas, there's a large history of anti-Mexican, and particular anti-Mexican policies that were passed. And those policies continue to be in our books and continue to affect and influence where Latinx people live, not because they are required to live there, but because of those policies, families have been thrust into areas where they have been put into perpetual poverty. And it's very difficult to get out of. So understanding that those intersections are important as we think about supporting and Latinx students and their families, that's something to remember. Also, remember la historia la escriben los vencedores. The history is written by those who win. And so that's why I wasn't interested in my educational, in my high school history class, because I was never represented in it. And when we were represented as they were the ones that lost. They weren't intelligent enough. They only immigrate here because blah, 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 blah. So it was always this in a negative perspective. And just a reminder that race is socially constructed and given meaning within the social context. As we see, it's not just about geography, it's also social context. During the Trump administration, there were certain things that were happening that directly influenced and impacted what is going on today. And we see those manifestations now. And so just thinking about that, in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movements created a lot of movement forward for a lot of marginalized and targeted populations. And we've slowly seen the trunking away of that as we have progressed through. And so social context and space really matters. I want to encourage you all, if you want to read a little bit more about this, these are some of my favorite authors. They are not in education, which I love. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, and they really help cement a lot of what I was talking about. Ana Cecilia Centella, Claudia Arias, Linda Alcoff, Miriam Jimenez Roman, Juan Flores, the list goes on and on. You have it right there. But I really encourage you to read their scholarship, which has been transformational for me. So just before I go into the content, and I know I'm already coming up in time, but this was a process of me search. As I was talking about myself and my experiences, this manuscript right here was a commissioned manuscript for AHI, the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and they gave me the ability and the freedom to do whatever I wanted with this commissioned piece, as long as it talked about Latinx folks. And so I said, this is the type of scholarship I wish I would have read when I was a student. This is a type of scholarship that would have helped me feel validated. And I finally felt the ability to be able to write something like this because I had the freedom to do it without the constraints of the peer. Well, it was still peer reviewed, but it was an invited piece. So they gave me feedback, but it wasn't, you're going to get rejected. And so I really, it was years of building up to this piece and thinking about me and my identity, my students, my family, and who we are. And then why are we in this current state? And so the foundations of thought for this piece really center around these three critical components, which are Garcia 2007 encouraged us to be more critical in interrogating the relationship between race and ethnicity by exploring the social manifestations of their complex interactions. And so that notion of relationship between race and ethnicity was something that was intriguing to me. Like, how are they related? How are they not? How do they work with one another? How do they sustain each other? What does that mean? And what does it look like in society? Also, the understanding that racial formation processes occur through a linkage between structures and representation. So thinking about, okay, this is going on, but what does that look like within institutions, within like larger contexts? Like what are the manifestations of it? And so then finally, I arrived at this notion that racial formation and hierarchy are maintained when formal structures control who is and is not represented or worthy of recognition. And so I was thinking about my experiences in education. I never felt represented. I never felt included. I never felt seen. I never felt welcome. And so then it became very evident to me that these thoughts were all interconnected and there must be something there that I needed to explore further. So although the US term LatinX is polysemic, it is often utilized an exclusionary mestizaje signifier, which in turn limits intergroup representation. So the story, the winner tells the story, right? So the way I interpreted that and connected to this is that when you bring such a diverse people into one pot and you place them in this one label, then what that does is it erases their history, erases who they are. It takes away their ability to understand where they come from. And when they don't know where they come from, then it's very difficult to understand and see where you're going. And so in that approach these were the foundational thoughts of this piece. I wanted to understand, why does this exist? Why is it in this way? How have we continued to sustain this process? What is our process in it? And so shout out to Amalia Dache, Dr. Dache, who when I was a doc student, I presented at an ASH, and she and I were talking, and she said, you really need to look at the scholarship of Latin American scholars. And I was like, I don't know. And I finally got around to doing it and reading their scholarship. And that's where Quijano came in. Quijano really pieced together this notion of coloniality of power. How are these systems sustained and how do they stay in place? Well, it's coloniality of power. And so Lau Montes asserts that categories of identification and cultural production were created and reproduced as part of a parcel of the world historical process of capitalistic development. So the social construction and categorization of people really upheld this notion of capitalism. And so you had to have workers and you had to have lots of them in order to make sure that production continued. And so I was like, but how does that connect to educational institutions? And so coloniality of power allows us to be able to see that. Despite racial and ethnic categories being socially constructed, they are utilized to justify, and the key word is justify, systemic inequities by placing blame on the marginalized for their misfortunes. So those in power are excused from having to admit that the colonization and slavery continue to strengthen inequities in modern day societies. So it is about, for example, in our schools, it is, why are they not graduating? Why do they not care? Why are they not engaged? Rather than saying, what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing, right? To make sure that we're engaging them. What should we do? How do we invite the parents into the conversation, and so on and so forth. Zubedi also reminds us that racial classification is an integral part of the process that justifies racial stratification. He concluded it leads to the biggest problem of the 20th century, given the construct of race holds, and I quote, a central role in producing the inequalities between non-European origin persons and European origin persons. Similarly, Quijano argued that the construct of race has been the most efficient instrument of social domination to date. Race, therefore, has become a very real aspect of social identity, and I quote, one that is masked on the body through learned perceptual practices of visual categorization with significant sociological and political effects, as well as psychological impact on self-formation. In a nutshell, coloniality of power tells us that that there is a system in place and that the marginalized are essentially marginalized folks have inevitably become implicit in their own marginalization, often without knowing it, as they give meaning to fabricated racial and ethnic signifiers. And because there's stereotypes cast upon us, and because there are expectations placed upon us, then sometimes it's easier to live out those expectations. And so coloniality of power and coloniality, how do they connect, right? So we have history, colonization, but what does it look like now? That's in the past, that's where Figueroa and Vasquez defined coloniality. as the continuation of colonial practices, ideologies, and structures, often long after nations have undergone administrative decolonization. One such practice is the incessant will of nations to box humans into racial and or ethnic categories. For Latinxs in the United States, this means that regardless of the neologism utilized to describe their existence, none will ever successfully encompass their complex intersecting identities, lived experiences, or the material consequences of having stereotypes and or expectations placed upon them. And it becomes complicated because more often than not, we don't realize we are living out expectations others had of us. Fanon asserted that colonial legacy of violence and abuse has permanently altered the human psyche of the colonized as well as the colonizer. He also noted that to view oneself through the perspective of the colonizer means to exist in a constant state of psychological, social, and physical coloniality, a process created, and I quote, for the colonial subject by colonial racism, end quote. Unfortunately, schools serve as a primary site of recolonization, and escaping the epistemic racial violence is nearly impossible for young minds. So, and especially because the expectations, if you read Angela Valenzuela's work on subtractive schooling, she makes it evident how educators, even though they weren't conscious of it, they had implicit biases that they were placing upon students, and students acted up upon those biases. And so I always like to, so I just covered a bunch of heavy stuff in a really quick time, right? And I always think about hope, and I want to segment hope in a lot of what I do and the majority of things that I do. And so I wanted to think about, okay, so all of that has happened. How do we move away from it? And that's where epistemic delinking comes in. Coloniality of power challenges us to think more expansively about liberation, agency, and the ways in which educators can challenge its harmful effects of coloniality. So I personally began thinking about the tensions that arise when Latinx identity is seated within a US-centric context devoid of hemispheric significance and absent of a colonial past. Colonization necessitates a delinking from dominant epistemologies that reinforce falsehoods through the perpetration of filtered knowledge that facilitates the erasure of non-white people. Epistemic decolonization illuminates diverse epistemologies that bring about inter-epistemic communication, knowledge formation, and eventually liberation. And it is that linkage and that interconnectedness that is the process towards moving forward. So we must pose questions to ourselves, right? This is a me process. If you're an educator, then posing questions to yourselves about the role of racialization on other populations or Latinidades, right? But also to think about what your role is in being implicit in that process and how you can break away from it. What are the readings that you're assigning in your classrooms? What are the epistemologies that you are centering? What is your pedagogical practice? And how do you interpret findings, and how do you present the experiences of marginalized populations? Because people are reading your work and they have real material life consequences for the population that you are presenting through your work. So so thinking about Latinos racialized as mestizos, as you can see, this does not happen by default. And what ends up happening is that it invisibilizes most Latinx folks. There's a large population of Latinx folks who are Afro-Latinx indigenous communities, and oftentimes their experiences are not centered within the Latinx scholarship. So it's really important for us to think about how coloniality of power perpetrates not only our thought process, but also knowledge production and our practices within academia. It also nurtures the false belief that there's a one-size-fits-all model. And I don't have time to go into HSIs and centering HSI perspectives and all of this, but there is this I think there is a danger in saying we are an HSI without really recognizing the intragroup diversity that exists. And yet there is this push to have a one-size-fits-all model to serving Latinx students. So in my concluding thoughts, this one-size-fits-all model, particularly being pushed by HSIs, could be very dangerous. And so I want to encourage educational, institutional educators, institutional leaders, and policymakers to really think about these three tenets: how U.S. Latinx identity is linked to land, globalization and the colonization of the Americas, and colonial powers that exercise domination over the people of the global South, and the construction of race and ethnicity. They amount to real life consequences for individuals, whether they be visceral experiences, psychological experiences, or actually physical experiences of not wanting to enter spaces where they don't feel safe or welcome. That it's not necessarily a choice, but who wants to be in spaces and places where, when they're being talked about or talking about their experiences, it's always through a deficit perspective. Coloniality of identity controls the use and meaning of group signifiers, the narratives that defines who they are, and ultimately their agency. And finally, epistemic delinking requires listening, hearing, and carrying out the will of those who you want to serve. Oftentimes we hear that people want to serve populations, but they don't ask the populations, whether it be Latinx folks or Indigenous folks or Black folks. How do we serve your needs? They go to manuscripts or to other areas where oftentimes they're not written by those members of the members of that community. So listening out, hearing, and then carrying out what they're asking is really important. And through that, and also centering their epistemic and ontological groundings and foundations of that community is really important. And I know I'm like running on time, so that's it. Thank you so much. And I wanted to leave time for questions. I know I zoomed past that.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, and just really quick, I wanted to, I had this slide and I accidentally clicked on it, but in case someone asked, but this is from my dissertation study. Let me share my screen again. This is from my dissertation study, and what I wanted to share here is how younger, so these were all undergraduate students in the Bronx. I asked them all to identify, to write down how they identified ethnically, racially, and culturally. And I want you to see, this was 12 participants, but I want you to see the diversity of ways in which they self-identify. And then I also want to point to your attention how some of them are like, I completely move away from ethnic racial categories. I am an intellectual, so I want to be known by my intellect. I want to be known as my work ethic. And so I thought that was also really important. And then culture and identity is also interconnected to space. So some of them are like, well, I'm a Bronxite, like I'm a Bronx native. And so that was also something. So breaking away from this notion. So 12 participants, 5 different languages spoken amongst them. And so again, Patois, Spanish, Spanglish, English, and a small dialect of Santa Catalina in Venezuela. So 5 different languages within this group. And so I just, again, thinking about Latinx heterogeneity, this was only 12 participants. Now imagine a whole diaspora.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia-Louis, for your wonderful, powerful, and informative presentation. And I especially appreciate you sharing your personal experience, and happy birthday to your doctor. Now I'm gonna open the floor for any question. I already see a raised hand, so maybe we can just start from here. If you have any question, feel free to unmute yourself and address it directly to Dr. Garcia-Louis.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, thank you so much, Doctora Garcia. Felicidades a la nena también. So I am, my work centers around education policy and specifically preschool education policy. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take my personal experience and and just explore how or whether my personal experience has been experienced by others, and how we can better understand just preschool education in general. So I'm in this is completely anecdotal. This is my personal experience. I'm probably going to piss some of you off. And so I just, in advance, I will apologize for pissing you off. That's not my intent. My intent is to have an open dialogue about this. So I am, my father's Puerto Rican from the island. I'm Caribeña. I spent the last 20 years of my life on an island in the United States, in Key West, Florida. I have ties to the land, to Puerto Rico, to the island. My mother's white. She's of English descent. Of course, I did the ancestry, DNA, whatever. And yeah, so I am half white, half Puerto Rican. And so I've constantly, and up until today, up until this very moment, this workshop, Dr. Garcia, you gave me some words that helped me to kind of give words to my experience. And that is, I'm carrying in my DNA, I'm carrying both the colonizer and the colonized, both like the oppressor and the oppressed. And and there was this fight, and it's always been this fight inside of me because I'm white, so I'm not oppressed, but I'm Puerto Rican, so I'm not white. And I grew up in a very racist small towns. We were migrants. We moved around a lot. So I have both experiences. Upon first look, you look at me, you hear me. Oh, she's a white lady. Upon getting to know me, people start to realize just how much I do identify as Puerto Rican. And so, you know what? I'm not sure what the point is of this. I just felt like this is a safe space for me to say that out loud. So thank you for letting me vent.
I hear what you're saying. I want to comment on what you're saying because we are often asked, I think your experience may be similar to my children, or what I thought of my children in terms of being bisected beings, right? So you're not a bisected being. You are not half this, half that. And I don't know where the quote comes from, but it's like, well, not half of you doesn't just like, beans and rice, and the other half doesn't just like, whatever food. It's like you're a holistic being. And so part of that process is reclaiming the ability to be able to say, yes, I'm Puerto Rican and I'm this, right? And being able to claim that identity and having the knowledge to be able to say, this is why I am, put into this categories because of the social construction of race and ethnicity. And we play into it by saying you are cast into that category versus that category. So I hear what you're saying. It's not a unique experience. It's the same experience that Afro-Latinx folks go through, but on the opposite end of being categorized as only Black and not Latinx as well. So the cultural components are also there.
Just as a follow-up, I don't feel like it is the same experience because I get the privilege of being white.
Yeah.
So that's a huge, I have this, I should be suffering more kind of thing, but I can't because I'm white. I know it's like this like existential fight I have for myself. So anyways, thank you so much for this. This really helped me a lot.
Others.
Hi, my name is Stacy Speller. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a second year PhD student at Howard University, and my research actually focuses on Afro-Latinidad and bridging the gap between Afro-Latinos and historically Black colleges and universities. As a proud New Yorican from the Bronx, both parents that adopted me raised me very Puerto Rican with those cultures, traditions, and values, but biologically, soy peruana. But I don't know that side at all. So your articles help so much with identity, right? A lot of what Rachel was talking about, giving me the jargon to really speak my truth and what that may look like, but then also with bridging this gap that I've seen. I'm a 3-time HBCU will be speaking into existence, but 3-time HBCU graduate. And historically Black colleges and universities have this unique role in the Black community. And sometimes it gets missed because the Black community, just like the Latinx community, is not homogenous. And so what Blackness looks like, right? And so on these campus spaces, what I'm trying to really dive into is how can our HBCUs really promote curriculum and instruction, and what responsibility, like what role do we have as these HBCUs to really talk about the diaspora? And it shouldn't be just at one HBCU, all HBCUs, right? And so, how do we implement pedagogy that decolonizes the mestizaje of Latinidad, but really centers Blackness in Spanish-speaking communities, nationally, internationally, etc. So what are your thoughts on that in these HBCU spaces with Afro-Latinidad?
Oh my gosh. Well, felicidades, third generation HBCU grad, because it is going to happen, right? I mean, speaking it into existence, it will happen. You're already there. I agree with your sentiment, but I'm gonna challenge all institutions to do it. We all have an obligation to have to do that. We all have an obligation to recognize that a lot of our medical advances were done on the bodies of Black bodies, right? We have to recognize and center that. We have to recognize and center that education has been a brutal process for many of our communities. And that's why many of us are first generation. And here in Texas, there was language genocide, just like in many other places where people were held back and beat at school, Mexican. That's why the same dirty Mexican comes from. They weren't allowed to go to the white schools. They had to trek through mud for hours to get to school. And the saying dirty Mexican comes from people trying to get access to education. So all of this information is important, and it's not just on HBCUs. I think we all have an obligation as educators, as parents, as siblings. I've had these conversations with my families around colorism. Colorism is endemic, not just in the Latino community, it's endemic everywhere. And so having conversations about that, I think, are really important. But I will say it's not just at the institutional level, it really needs to happen at home. It needs to happen at home first. And when we raise children who are conscious, when we raise children who are proud, then that permeates elsewhere. But educators have the responsibility to read beyond the heteronormative, white Eurocentric scholarship that is often centered in schools.
Hi, Dr. Garcia. Thank you so much for your chat today. I'm a Latina. I'm originally from Paraguay, but I got my higher ed degrees here in the US. And something I've been exploring a little bit is this framework of Anzaldua's framework of conocimiento.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, how much does your work intersect with this work of like navigating conflicting identities as students perhaps navigate institutions in the US, higher education, and even navigating their identity. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that.
I love it. I love Anzaldúa, and just like all of us, she was human, right? So she has passed, but there's things that I critique about it, right? So like she glorifies an indigenous past without recognizing the complexities of an indigenous current situation, right? Mestizaje is something that she falls heavily on, but some of the stuff that she has done, I wouldn't necessarily categorize anti-Black, but it's borderline anti-Black. So she's full of contradictions, but what I love about Anzaldúa is that she paved the way for so many of us women, and in particular women who identify as queer Latinx women, to have a space to talk about being in the spiritual space. It allowed us, her work was able to penetrate the sterile confines of institutions and allow us to be able to talk about the visceral, the physical, the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual realm that many of our communities rely on for hope and resistance. And so I love her work. I think, borderlands and living in the borderlands and Nepantla and bringing in a lot of the conocimiento from indigenous communities is something that I absolutely love. And she has, everyone everyone, I guess, is vulnerable. When you put your work out there, it should be critiqued, right? And so I have utilized her work quite a bit, actually, and added, some components to, especially like the Blackness component to some of it. But yeah, I love her work. I think she's amazing. Others?
Yes, may I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Hi,
I remember you, Venus.
Good to see you here. I loved everything about the presentation. I'm taking notes. And I do have a research question, if I may.
Yes.
It's like there's this balance between the spectacle of our identities our cultural identities, our ways of being, our ancestral knowledge and wisdom, and balancing that with the expectations of larger social structures and institutions. So you mentioned, you know, some of our favorite theorists, right? But you too are speaking from some very personal cultural knowledge and wisdoms. And so how do you balance that? What's the responsibilities of the state? What's the responsibilities of the individual caregivers, healers, you know, wisdom holders, and that of our responsibilities to the collective knowledge of the institutions and people that we are affiliated with, who may have done some of the harm? So what's sacred and what's for public consumption?
Yes. Okay, this is like you're getting to the mommy Claudia, right? I firmly believe so my approach and my understanding of this continues to evolve. So this is, I'm giving you the mommy Claudia now, right? I think that it happens at the home. The change needs to happen within the home. And the reason why I say that is because I think about what I wish I would have known about myself when I was growing up, and I bring it into my children. Because one of the biggest things that prohibited me from being able to be here today was my own self-confidence. There was this notion of respeto, respect, and you don't talk back to teachers. It doesn't matter what they say, you respect them. There's this notion of respecting authority, and those are good foundational values, but sometimes they're utilized against us. And so what I teach my daughter is, yes, you respect your elders, you respect them, but you also ask them to respect you, and you don't take disrespect, right? And so how do you do it in a way that is respectful and yet affirming to you? And I think that it comes with raising strong children who know who they are, who understand their identities, who can I think about the metaphor of a tree. The deeper your roots go, the less likely you are to get knocked over by hurricane winds. And I think about society as hurricane winds, and I think about my children as, you know, those little trees, and I want their roots to be so deep in there. And so we have conversations in my family, not just in my immediate family, in my entire family, in my larger family, about colorism, about classism. We have conversations about LGBTQ plus communities. We have conversations about gender identity and sexuality and so many other things. And at the end of the day, we say, but we can't have these conversations only in our household. Then we have to have these conversations outside. And so we have these conversations with our friends, right? So I think it's not just, it's a very long-winded response to your question, but I think that then the individual goes and affects their sphere of influence where they are at. And I do believe that that's how you affect change. I also think about the notion of voting and people saying, well, the system is so screwed up. If I vote, my vote doesn't matter. And I ask them, but have you voted? And they say no. And I say, well, then you don't have a right to complain because you didn't vote. If you have the right to vote and you didn't vote, then you don't have a right to complain. So I find similarities in that as well. We say we need to engage, and you know, in its long wind, it takes a long time to get there. As an educator now, I have the responsibility not just to do this type of work in my classroom and through my scholarship, but to go out into my local community and work with the local schools. So I have grants that are located in elementary schools and our poorest school districts, working with marginalized parents and paying them to be a part of programs, and not just $20, they're getting $500 to come and learn skills, math and science skills that are taught through a culturally embracive method in Spanish so that they can then support their children. And guess what? They get science manipulatives that they can keep at home so they can continue the learning. And if they can't make it, they have Zoom links available to them, but they still get the financial support. So thinking about it in that way, I'm using where I am to also bring my community in here, and then also pushing our administration to say Hispanic thriving. What does that mean when the local community doesn't even feel they can step foot on campus? What does that look like? And so very long-winded response, but I think that it's all interconnected. The individual doesn't realize how much influence they're able to have until they begin to do the work. And then you begin to see the fruits of your labor, because it's not just you doing the work. You have a family, you have a community, you have a department, you have students that are doing similar work.
Thank you.
Yes.
so thinking about the QualLab, and you just started to give tangible example for us about how this shows up as in your research, paying people who are with you in the research a substantial amount to value time. And are there other ways that this approach, your work of linking and decolonization and really interrogating this comes to your research? It's not divorced from it. It's linked very much in what you presented. How does it show up, and what advice do you have for this team with our research design?
I think that when I was trained to not think about myself as part of the research, and I very much am part of it. And so my work is in higher education, but I'm working with elementary school girls. And I said, we are going to develop this together. You tell me what you want to do. So really breaking away from this notion of hierarchies. And of course, I'm not immune to it. There's still things that happen, but the girls are telling me what they want to learn. They're telling me of the field trips they want to go on. We're going to go to NASA. So I have to figure out how to get a chartered bus and get all of these girls to NASA, but we're doing it because they want to go, right? So it's not going into communities and saying, this is what I was taught and this is how we do it, but rather saying, you tell me how we do it. Very Paulo Freire perspective and approach. And then also in the coding process, I think that's where a lot of it gets lost, because yes, I come from poverty and yes, I'm an immigrant, but that was years ago. Poverty and immigration look so different now than they did when I was, at their age. So inviting them to be a part of it, member checking is extremely important, and inviting them to be a part of the process. So can children member check? Absolutely. I think that we place so many limitations on children and family members and immigrants and non-English native speakers. So it's breaking away those, I think for me, it has been really liberating myself from the confines that I was taught were required to create effective and efficient and scholarly work, and saying, no, this is what it looks like to do scholarly work. This is what it looks like to work with communities. So it's not about changing the name from subject to co-developer, but rather doing the work, right? You can change the name and it doesn't change anything about the process, but if you're engaging them with if you're inviting them to be there with you in the development phase, I think I have found that to be very liberating.
We have time for one more question. Sankina, if you want to directly raise your question.
Hi, first and foremost, thank you so very much for this beautiful talk.
Thank you.
I'm learning so much. I just feel very grateful.
Thank you.
So I wanted to voice that just so that you hear it and never have to wonder. And people are also lighting up the chat and giving you love. So I just wanted to make sure that you feel that. Yeah, that's why I'm like, I want you to feel that. I want you to see that. This is amazing. I'm in a coffee shop, so you may hear the music in the background, but
You're good.
My question was in response to the work that you did, your grant work that you described in the communities where you're paying the mothers that you're working with and so forth. I wanted to know if that was written up somewhere, because I definitely want to use it in my courses and, disseminate that on this end. And yeah.
So no, and I'll tell you all this. That grant was funded through ETS. Jamal Watson gave me the opportunity to do that work. I just got it funded. We're just doing the work now. And so there will be work that will be coming out of it. But I met with the girls and they told me, we want to go to NASA. And I told them, we have a lot of museums here. And I said, what museum do you want to go to? They're like, no, we don't want to go here. We want to go to NASA. So, in that process, that was a highlight for me. So I mentioned that this work will be coming out, data collection will be ongoing for 3 years. But what I will say is that I applied to Spencer, and one of the reviewers, and I got rejected, right? For a large grant. And one of the reviewers said, if you pay populations that much money, you're going to coerce them to continue with the work, continue in the study. And my response to that was disbelief, because it's better to not pay them and not compensate them for their time. And so for me, it was mixed emotions. Like I could see how someone could see that paying families to be a part of this may be coercing them, but I see it the opposite way. I feel that they missed the whole approach to inviting them to be a part of the process, right? And so there will be, if this is a type of work that calls you, I want to name the fact that there will be a lot of roadblocks in the way, and funding is going to be an issue when we talk about working with communities. They want set frameworks. And that was one of the things that I got dinged on was, but it's so open, like, and that's the whole point. The method is supposed to be open because we're co-developing it. And so I know you didn't ask that particularly that question.
No, but this is great. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And thank you. And I will be on the lookout.
Yes,
so
reach
please.
out. I can come visit your class if you want.
Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. All right. Thank you so much.
So thank you everyone for being so engaged in the Q&A session. And thank you again, Dr. Garcia-Louis, for your participation. So before we close, I just want to let you know that we have 3 more lunch talks planned this semester. So the next one will happen on October 20th, which is also a Thursday at the same time. So please sign up for any of these talks by scanning the QR code, and you can also watch the recordings of the previous talks on our YouTube channel. Another big part of our work at the QualLab is that we provide consultation in qualitative research methodologies and methods. So this service is currently only open to faculty, postdoc, researcher, and graduate students at the College of Education and Human Ecology. And it can be about a grant, a research project, dissertation, publication, just anything other than your coursework. There are 2 ways you can use this service. You can either attend our open consultation hours every Thursday morning between 9 to 11 on Zoom, or schedule a one-on-one virtual consultation with us. And you can scan the QR code here for more information. So this marks the end of our lunch talk today. Thank you all for joining us, and we wish to see you again at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you want to
Thank
take off
you.
your microphone and